Hi everyone. Today we're going to trace the quiet steps that turned into thunder, a story that began not with a speech or a headline, but with a whisper in a quiet room. You'll never believe it, but after one discreet meeting in Geneva, a ripple began that would stretch across continents and challenge the very idea of how change begins. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And comment below with your location and local time. I want to know where you're watching from. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft noise, and let's get started tonight. It was a room no larger than a studio apartment, tucked away behind layers of diplomatic facades and stone corridors. Geneva, cold and grey outside, offered no hint of the warmth that would unfold inside those four walls. Ibrahim Traoré sat first. Quiet, as always. He looked out the window, not at the skyline, but at the way the clouds hung low, pressing down like expectation. He had come with no fanfare, travelling lightly, carrying only a notebook and the weight of his people's hopes. Jasmine Crockett arrived moments later. She wore black, simple but sharp, and walked like someone used to moving through noise, but today she welcomed the silence. No reporters, no staff, just purpose. There was no table between them, just two chairs facing each other. She offered a smile. He nodded once, and the conversation began. Not as leaders, not even as allies, but as witnesses. Witnesses to systems that were breaking, to people left behind, to a world too distracted by screens and power to hear the soft cries at the edge of progress. Ibrahim spoke first. Not about governments or geopolitics, but about a village school in Burkina Faso, where children shared pencils and learned by candlelight. He described the quiet defiance of farmers reclaiming ancestral land. Jasmine listened, letting the words pour over her like water, smoothing stone. Then she spoke of housing projects in Texas with broken elevators and broken trust, of single mothers navigating 3 jobs while raising voices never meant to be silenced. She didn't cry, but her voice cracked once, just once. They didn't interrupt each other, they didn't look at clocks. For 3 hours the world outside faded, and what remained was raw, something you don't get in press conferences or campaign ads. They talked about what leadership meant, how real power wasn't in being followed, but in being felt. They asked each other questions not to challenge, but to understand. What does liberation look like? What does healing sound like? By the end, no agreements had been signed, no slogans created, but they had made something more durable, a blueprint of trust. As they stood to leave, Jasmine reached into her coat and handed Ibrahim a small pin, shaped like an open ear. "For listening," she said. He smiled gently, pulled a folded cloth from his pocket, a strip of Faso Dan Fani, and placed it in her hand. "For remembering," he replied. Outside, Geneva's cold hadn't changed, but something else had. They walked away separately. But both carried a mission stitched into silence. They had whispered to each other. And the world, though it didn't know it yet, was about to start listening. They didn't announce it. There were no press releases, no carefully crafted statements. After Geneva, Jasmine and Ibrahim disappeared back into their corners of the world, but something followed them. Not just memory, intention. Jasmine returned to Dallas with a different kind of energy. She no longer looked to City Hall or Congress for permission to act. She looked into the eyes of the people who greeted her outside grocery stores, in barber shops, on sidewalks under flickering street lamps. There was power there, untapped, waiting. She gathered a small circle, not campaign staff, not high-profile consultants, just educators, elders, youth organizers, and formerly incarcerated men who had found their voices again. She gave them a single task: listen, then act. They didn't meet in boardrooms, they met in basements and basketball courts, places where the echo of honesty wasn't muffled by ceiling tiles. Jasmine called it the table. Not because there was one, but because everyone had a seat. Across the ocean, in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim was doing something similar. He started with silence. He visited rural villages without media, no speeches, just walking and sitting, listening, to mothers grinding millet, to boys repairing bicycles from scrap, to griots who remembered the way before the way. He returned to the capital, not with declarations but with stories. And then, with those stories, he began something called the Roots Network, a people-powered assembly that asked every community, "What do you know that we've forgotten?" These weren't policies, these were seeds. He planted one in each region, entrusting young leaders to water them with ideas, not just allegiance. He wasn't looking for obedience. He was searching for ownership. And while none of this made headlines, change doesn't always begin with applause. Sometimes it begins with a single voice saying, "What if we tried something different? What if leadership was quiet first? What if movements didn't start from podiums but from porches?" Jasmine's table and Ibrahim's Roots Network never mentioned each other publicly, but they were the same shape, carved from the same moment in Geneva. They shared documents through encrypted messages. Blueprints drawn on napkins became workshops. Voice notes turned into community training videos. Sometimes they just texted simple truths like, "Don't rush the soil," or "If they don't see us coming, they won't stop us." By summer, the results were beginning to bloom. In Dallas, vacant lots were transformed into community gardens, run by teens, protected by elders, nourished by single moms with soil under their nails and strength in their hands. In Burkina Faso, rural women's cooperatives began printing books in local dialects, books based not on colonial textbooks, but on the oral traditions they grew up with. The media didn't know where to look because nothing was flashy. But beneath the surface, something real was forming, something durable, a quiet revolution built not on spectacle, but on listening, trust, and the courage to believe that small can be sacred. It wasn't just a plan, it was a promise. It started with children. In a third-grade class in Fort Worth, a girl stood up during a writing assignment and asked her teacher, "Can we write about what we'd change if we were president?" The teacher, surprised, said yes. That same week, in a village outside Koudougou, Burkina Faso, a young boy asked, during a storytelling circle, "What if we wrote down the stories ourselves instead of waiting for someone else?" Neither classroom knew about the other, but their questions sparked something. Soon, in neighborhoods where people once whispered, voices began to rise. Not in anger, not yet, but in curiosity. Community centers in Texas filled with locals eager to learn about community budgeting. In Ouagadougou, students hosted debate nights by candlelight, discussing justice in their native languages. It wasn't a campaign, it was a current. Every conversation, every small meeting, every community sketch of possibility, it all began to pulse with something electric. In Jasmine's district, bus drivers began volunteering as neighborhood reporters, recording voice memos about what they saw, what people needed. These recordings were broadcast on public speakers in barbershops and laundromats. In Ibrahim's country, market women formed justice circles, informal assemblies that settled local disputes using ancestral customs combined with civic discussion. They didn't wait for courts, they became them. What was whispered in Geneva had become murmurs in cities, chants in schoolyards, and questions in places once silent. And it wasn't just the organizers anymore. Local musicians in both countries started remixing speeches into beats. A track called Rooted Voices went viral on TikTok, bridging the Sahel and the South through rhythm. Art students began painting murals of community leaders on forgotten walls. One girl, aged 12, painted Jasmine as a tree growing from a sidewalk crack, leaves reaching the sky. The movement didn't need spokespeople, it had storytellers. The message spread faster than any press release ever could, because it wasn't polished, it was real. A grandmother in Shreveport shared a photo of her porch gathering with the caption, "We call it the table," just like the congresswoman said. A teenage boy in Togo made a YouTube video explaining Ibrahim's youth policies to his peers, filmed in one take on a cracked phone, but viewed by thousands. And that's when people outside started to notice. Journalists called it strange. Think tanks labeled it untracked grassroots activity. But they didn't get it. This wasn't organized the way they were used to. It was symphonic, not scripted. Community-led, not committee-bound. It was not a storm. It was a steady rain, awakening long-dormant seeds. And yet, as the movement grew, so did the shadows around it. Not everyone smiled at this strange new shape of power rising from porches and dirt roads. But for now, in this moment, the sparks were catching fire, and no one could put them out. They didn't expect it to be easy, but they didn't expect it to get this dark either. The movement had grown beyond them. Jasmine and Ibrahim were no longer its architects, but its witnesses. And with that growth came attention, not all of it welcome. In Texas, local media outlets began running hit pieces. They called Jasmine's neighborhood forums unauthorized gatherings, spinning the image of a rogue leader undermining traditional systems. A think tank circulated a memo warning about radical community organizing infecting civic trust. In Ouagadougou, things were harsher. A government-aligned newspaper ran an editorial questioning Ibrahim's patriotism, accusing him of importing foreign ideologies. International donors began pulling out of education initiatives he'd supported. Within his own administration, whispers began of instability, of betrayal, of the old guard preparing to reclaim control. And then came the leak. A video clip, taken out of context, showed Ibrahim quoting a line Jasmine had texted him. "The people who taught us silence now fear our sound." It was spun as a threat. The backlash was swift. Overnight, allies turned cold. Former supporters demanded explanations. The Roots network was labeled subversive. Jasmine wasn't spared either. One of her most trusted advisors resigned, citing a need to return to the center. She received veiled warnings from fellow lawmakers. Don't get too close to international trouble. Don't get too loud. The walls were closing in. But here's the part no one saw coming. They didn't flinch. They doubled down. Jasmine returned to the table, not with defiance, but with transparency. She showed the community the hit pieces, read them out loud. "They think this ends us," she said quietly. "But this proves we've touched a nerve." Ibrahim went rural. He left the capital for 3 weeks, visiting every village where the Roots network had sprouted. He listened. He asked, "Do we keep going?" The answer, every time, was yes. In response to the backlash, they did something brilliant. They stepped back and let the people step forward. It started in small ways. A retired teacher in Texas began hosting nightly porch conversations, recording them and uploading to a channel called Table Talk. In Burkina Faso, young engineers built an offline radio loop broadcasting root stories through recycled equipment. But then it spread wider. People who had never spoken into microphones began grabbing them. A market woman in Bobo Dioulasso stood at a town square and said, "We are not dangerous. We are gardeners of something new." A 17-year-old in Houston posted a spoken word video called They can't cancel grassroots. It hit 1 million views in 4 days. And when asked by a reporter if they'd respond to the smear campaign, Jasmine just smiled and said, "I don't need to." You're already hearing from the people. That's what they didn't understand. The movement had grown beyond personalities. It wasn't about Jasmine or Ibrahim anymore. It was about those who found their voice in a world that kept stealing it. And now those voices were too loud and too many to be drowned out. By the time autumn arrived, it was clear something had shifted. Not just in policy or protests, but in the very rhythm of how people showed up for each other. They called it the turning. It happened first in a small church basement in Memphis. A crowd gathered for what was meant to be a discussion on housing, but what erupted was a chorus of people sharing truths they'd never said aloud. A single mother admitted her fear of eviction. A teenager confessed he didn't know how to vote but wanted to learn. The meeting ran 5 hours long, and nobody left. In Burkina Faso, a festival emerged, not planned, not sanctioned, but born of momentum. Villagers travelled for miles to meet under a canopy of trees. They shared poems, songs, and testimonies of community justice. A griot stood and said, "For the first time, we aren't waiting for leaders to fix things, we are the fixing." And still Ibrahim and Jasmine stood back, not absent, just quiet, observing, letting others rise. At one event in Atlanta, Jasmine took a seat in the back row, unannounced. She clapped with the crowd, cried during a story, and left without taking the stage. Someone caught a glimpse and whispered, "Was that her?" And someone else replied, "It doesn't matter. This is ours now." In Kaya, a group of mothers began a local education fund using money from communal harvests. They named it Memory First, a tribute to Ibrahim's call to learn from what's already known. They didn't ask permission, they just started. And perhaps the most striking moment came during a youth summit in Lagos, streamed globally. A 15-year-old stood before a sea of young faces and said, "We don't want to be told anymore, we want to be heard. The mic isn't borrowed, it's ours now." That video went viral, but more importantly, it inspired replication. Mic circles began appearing around the world, spaces where anyone, regardless of status or age, could speak and be honored. No agenda, just truth. And in all of it, that whisper from Geneva, once so fragile, had become a movement too powerful to contain. The world tried to silence it, discredit it, even absorb it into systems designed to dull its edge, but it failed because the movement had no single leader, no singular face. It had millions. The people had taken the mic, and they weren't giving it back. This was never a story about a flight, a photo, or even a meeting in Geneva. It was a story about what happens when two people, Jasmine Crockett and Ibrahim Traoré, choose to listen more deeply than the world expects. When they returned from that quiet room, they didn't launch a campaign. They sparked a conversation, and that conversation became a wave. Through community gardens and village councils, through porch talks and mic circles, they taught us something essential. You don't need a podium to be powerful. You just need presence, courage, and the willingness to believe that ordinary people, when heard, are extraordinary. They faced backlash, they faced betrayal, but they didn't retreat. They released, and in doing so, they made space for others to step in, stand up, and speak out. That is what real leadership looks like. It's not control, it's trust, it's not noise, it's resonance. So as you sit in your own chair tonight, ask yourself, what whisper are you holding in? Who haven't you listened to yet? And what might change if you gave someone else the mic? Comment below with how this story made you feel. What parts reminded you of your own life? What part of the world are you watching from? Your comment could spark someone else's awakening. And if you believe in stories like this, if you believe the quiet ones matter, subscribe. Support this channel so we can keep bringing you narratives that inspire, challenge, and connect.